So the big question in the gospel this morning, I think, really is, what are you seeking? What is your life about? What is the meaning of your life? Don't want to know about the big philosophical question of life in general. Like, what is the meaning of your life? Because for however many years you've been alive, you have been pursuing something, and you have been sacrificing things in the pursuit of that goal. Now, you may not even be consciously aware that you've been pursuing a goal. Maybe because everyone around you is doing the same thing, you just assume that's normal. But what is it? And is it the right thing? Now, when you look at people's lives, a lot of people have big dreams. They dream of greatness, but they never actually get off the couch. I see this a lot with young people today. How many young men dream of being the greatest basketball player ever or the greatest soccer player ever, but they pursue that goal by playing video games about soccer. It only stays at the level of a dream. But you see other people who become obsessive. They set their desire on one thing, and they will pursue that relentlessly. And there is something really virtuous in that, I think. But once again, it's the question of whether your treasure is actually something lasting. So if I can give a few examples. So myself, as a teenager, I was obsessed by sport. And particularly, I fell in love with road cycling. So if you've ever watched the Tour de France, the most beautiful sport in the world, and I fed that desire by watching endless hours of cycling, and had that desire to see how great I could become. And so every day, morning and evening, I would be on the bike training as hard as I could. And I had a clear goal that I had to get to this particular level if that treasure was ever to be realized. And the amount of suffering I was prepared to put myself through in the pursuit of that goal is, these days I look back and I just laugh at it. Just as an example, obviously to be a good cyclist, you need to be very, very strong, and you need to be able to climb mountains very quickly. I grew up in Perth where there are no mountains, so I found the biggest hill I could find, and I would just ride that hill endlessly. And I would put the bike in the hardest gear it had, and I would ride up that hill sitting down again and again and again. And I basically made a vow to myself that I would never stop on a hill no matter how hard it was, because I was so obsessed with the goal. Until one day I was halfway up this hill and my calf muscle completely cramped up, and I had this very quick decision to make. I either stop or I pursue my goal. And I decided, I've already made the decision. I know what my treasure is. And so I turned the pedal one more time, tore my calf muscle, unclipped my foot from the pedal, and then continued to ride up with one leg. It was obsessive. But the reality was that for everything I sacrificed for that goal, a few months later I lost all of it. I got hit with a bad illness, and because I had zero body fat already, my body ate into muscle, and in 2 days I lost 2 days worth of training, or 2 years worth of training, just vanished. And for me it was such a wake-up call that I could give so much for something which I could lose so quickly. Another great example for my family history, my great-grandfather, a guy by the name of Jeremiah McAuliffe. He was living in Ireland as a teenager, and he heard that there was gold being discovered around the world. And so as a teenager, he left home and he travelled to the other end of the world in pursuit of a pretty-looking rock. It's basically what it was. He basically gave everything he had to travel by boat, ended up in far north Queensland, trying to find gold there, didn't find much. He heard that there was just a brand new gold discovery in the north of WA near Halls Creek. He didn't have enough money to travel by boat, so he walked. He teamed up with an Indigenous guy who showed him how to get across the desert, and he walked from Cairns all the way across to Halls Creek. By the time he got there, all the gold had run out because so many people had got there before him. He then managed to get all the way down to near Kalgoorlie, and he found a huge pile of gold. Became very rich very quickly. And for a couple of years, he was living the dream until someone convinced him to invest in a very lucrative business deal, and he lost everything. Once again, how much you can sacrifice for something which disappears. This is what Jesus is saying when he talks about the kingdom of heaven. He says the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field. And if you actually encounter the richness of that treasure, you would be prepared to sacrifice everything to own it. Now, this should challenge you, because I think most Catholics take their faith completely for granted. We just assume God loves us, we're going to go to heaven, what more do we need to do? I give 1 hour a week, I come to church, surely that's enough. But I think sadly the reality is that for most Catholics that treasure has remained buried. Sure, you might own the field, but you've never actually dug down to encounter what's there. Have you actually encountered the richness of your faith? Have you met Jesus? If you look in the scriptures, there's a couple of times where it really challenges us about this. When St. Paul writes in his first letter to the Corinthians, he actually uses this sporting analogy where he talks about how people will give everything to win the race, to become the greatest and win the wreath. But he says at the end of the day, that wreath you wear is going to wither. And Paul says, I pursue Christ with that same passion, and I discipline myself. He even says, I beat my body, I train it as hard as an athlete would, because I don't want to be disqualified at the end of the race. I want to be able to run all the way to the end in my pursuit of Jesus. If you go back to the Old Testament, in the book of Job, chapter 28 of the book of Job, there is this passage about pursuing wisdom, the wisdom of God. And it uses that image of someone seeking gold. It says, when you look at how much a person will sacrifice to try to find gold, they will leave civilization. They will go off in solitude. They'll carve tunnels into mountains, suspended by ropes while they hang in the darkness, looking by candlelight for the tiniest glimmer in the rock. And it basically challenges us saying, who will pursue wisdom with the same passion? Now, I think this really needs to challenge us. I look back at my sporting background, and every day it challenges me about how lazy I am in my faith. When I look at how much I was prepared to sacrifice for vainglory, it stands as this constant witness of would I be prepared to do the same thing to encounter the depths of the love of God, to pursue the wisdom of God. And I think this is where we need to realize that there is so much more that we have not yet seen. I always say this to teenagers, if you come to church and you think that church is boring, you've missed it. You have not seen the treasure. And the question is whether you walk away and abandon your faith and just assume that there's nothing there, or whether you give it the benefit of the doubt and you start digging. You start pursuing that treasure. For me, I think the thing that turned me around was when I started to read the lives of the saints. And I started to see people who had lived lives very similar to myself, but at some point they saw something. At some point their eyes were opened to the beauty of Christ, and they were taken over by a madness. That same madness that compels someone to leave everything to pursue their beloved. You see people like Francis of Assisi, who was living the dream as a young man. He was the most popular person. He was seen as being the king of the party. And yet suddenly he abandons all of that so that he can go and live as a beggar, trying to live poverty as much as he can, simply so that he can encounter Jesus Christ. You look at the story of someone like St. Augustine, same thing. A young man, successful, intellectual, could have achieved anything in the world. And at one point in his life, it's like his eyes were opened to what had always been in front of him. And when he speaks about that moment of seeing Jesus, he speaks with this deep regret. In his autobiography, he says, late have I loved you, O beauty so ancient and new. Late have I loved you. He was 35 when he had his conversion, but he's grieving because he's saying, I've just wasted 35 years pursuing rubbish when I could have been pursuing Jesus. I think this is the question of, have you seen what he saw? Have you encountered that beauty which has compelled people in every generation to leave everything and go and follow? Or are you just still sitting on the surface, content that the treasure is buried beneath you? We need to pray to have courageous souls. We need to be people who are courageous enough to pursue God. And if that simply means stepping into a church for 5 minutes at the end of the day on your way home from work and just sitting in silence and saying, God, if you're there, show yourself. Or if it means committing yourself to reading a chapter of the Gospels every night and just saying, Lord, show me what I'm not seeing. Help me to fall in love with you. To simply start that journey in pursuit of the eternal treasure and allow God to do the rest as he captures your heart and draws you to himself.